Okay, so you know, as a philosopher, you're no stranger to the concept of rights,
Right.
right? It's
Yeah.
like everywhere you turn, politics, law, ethics, it's always about rights.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
But then, like, the more you think about it, the more complex it gets.
Absolutely.
You know? Like, what are rights, really? Where do they come from? Why do they matter?
Those are the big questions. Yeah.
So that's exactly what we're going to tackle in this deep dive. We're going to really unpack the philosophical analysis of rights
Right.
using this really in-depth entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of
It's a
Philosophy.
good one. Yeah.
It's like a super dense, comprehensive overview.
Yeah. It covers a lot of ground.
It does. So we're going to be focusing on these like general theoretical issues. We're not getting into specific debates
Right. Right.
about like gun control or abortion or anything like that. We're really trying to understand rights as a concept.
The core of it.
Exactly.
Right.
So for you, our philosopher listener, this is going to be like a deep dive into the foundation, the different theories, the arguments, the criticisms. Hopefully you'll come away with some new insights.
At least some food for thought.
Definitely. So to kick things off, just think about all the different things people claim as rights.
It's a long list.
It is. It's kind of overwhelming, right?
Yeah. The entry calls it a profusion of rights.
A profusion, I like that.
Right. The right to life, the right to choose, the right to vote, the right to strike.
The right to a decent internet connection.
Maybe someday.
Maybe someday. But seriously, with so many rights claims flying around, how do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, that's where categorization comes in.
Categorization, right?
It's about trying to bring some order to this jumble of rights.
So how do philosophers go about categorizing rights?
One fundamental way is by looking at who holds the right.
Okay, so who's got the right?
Exactly. Are you talking about individual rights, like the rights of children, adults, maybe even animals?
Right.
Or are we talking about group rights, like the rights of workers, states, nations?
So individual versus collective.
Exactly. And then we can categorize rights by what they pertain to.
The content of the right.
Yeah. So are we talking about rights to free expression, privacy, property, bodily integrity?
Right, right. The classic stuff.
Yeah, the usual suspects. But then for a philosopher, it gets really interesting when you start asking why someone has a right.
Why, that's the juicy part, isn't it?
It is. This is about the source of the right's authority. It's grounding.
So, like, where does this right come from? What makes it legitimate?
Precisely. Are we talking about moral rights, like based on some fundamental moral principle?
Right.
Or legal rights, derived from a society's legal system?
Right, right.
Or even customary rights arising from long-standing social practices?
So moral, legal, customary, that's a good starting point.
It is. And then within moral rights, you have further subcategories.
Like what?
Well, you have things like natural rights.
Ah, natural rights. Those are always fun.
Right. The idea that certain rights are just inherent to human nature.
Inalienable rights, can't live with them, can't live without them.
Exactly. And then you have more specific categories like rights related to political speech or religious freedom.
Right, rights within rights.
It's layers upon layers. And then the final major category the entry outlines is how these rights can be affected.
Okay, so, like, can you lose a right? Can you give it up?
Exactly. This is about whether a right is considered inalienable, forfeitable, or waivable.
So inalienable means you can't lose it no matter what.
Right. Like the right not to be tortured, for example. That's generally considered inalienable.
Okay. What about forfeitable?
Forfeitable means you can lose the right if you do something specific.
So if you commit a crime, you might forfeit some of your rights.
Exactly. You might lose your right to freedom of movement, for example, if you're imprisoned.
Right. And then waivable.
Waivable means you can choose to give up the right.
Like if you sign a contract, you might be waiving certain rights.
Precisely. You might waive your right to sue over a specific matter, for example.
Interesting. So we've got all these different ways to categorize rights, but the real philosophical work begins when we start looking at the connections between these categories.
Absolutely. That's where we move from simply sorting to really analyzing what these rights mean and how they relate to each other.
Like, are all human rights also moral rights? Or can a legal right ever contradict a moral right?
Exactly. And the entry highlights some specific puzzles within these categories.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, there's this really thought-provoking question raised by Steiner about whether it's even logically possible for a right to be both inalienable and unwaivable.
Wait, explain that to me. How could a right be inalienable, meaning you can't lose it, but also waivable, meaning you can give it up?
That's the puzzle. Can you truly have a right that can never be taken from you, but that you can also choose to relinquish? It gets at the very heart of what it means to have a right.
That's a head-scratcher for sure.
It is. And then Anderson's work delves into the question of who can even be a holder of moral rights.
Ah, so expanding the who category.
Exactly. Does moral considerability extend beyond humans? To animals,
Please,
to
yeah.
ecosystems? That gets into some deep philosophical territory.
It does. So we've mapped this vast landscape of rights and all these different ways of categorizing them. But to really grasp what a right is, we need to dig deeper into its internal structure and its function.
Right, we need to move from sorting to dissecting.
Exactly. And the entry refers to this as the analysis of rights.
It's about trying to understand the precise meaning of rights assertions by looking at their form, their underlying structure, and their function and what they do for the right holder.
Okay, so form and function, two sides of the same coin.
Precisely. Form is about the anatomy, the building blocks, and function is about the purpose, the effect.
Got it. Let's start with the form. And here, we immediately encounter the work of Wesley Holfeld and his analytical system.
Oh, Holfeld, he's a big name in legal theory.
He is. And this Hofeldian framework, it sounds like it's crucial for understanding how rights are constructed.
It is. Holfeld argued that most of the rights we talk about, the familiar ones, they're not these simple, indivisible things. They actually have a complex internal structure.
So, like, rights are made of smaller parts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He compares it to molecules being made up of atoms.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah. And he identifies 4 fundamental incidents, as he calls them, that are like the building blocks of rights.
The atomic elements of rights, that's a cool way to think about it.
It is. And these 4 incidents are privilege, sometimes called liberty claim, power, and immunity.
Okay, so 4 key ingredients. Let's break those down one by one.
Sure. So first up, privilege.
Privilege, what does that mean in the Feldian sense?
It basically means that if you have a privilege to do something,
Right.
it simply means you have no duty not to do it.
Okay, so it's about what you're allowed to do, in the sense that no one can stop you.
Exactly. Like if you have the privilege to walk across a public park,
Right.
it means there's no rule saying you can't walk across the park.
So it's the absence of a prohibition, not necessarily a positive entitlement.
Exactly. You're not being granted a special right to walk. You're just not being forbidden from doing so.
Okay, that makes sense.
Uh,
What about claim? How's that different from privilege?
a claim is more about a directed duty,
Directed.
meaning the duty is owed to a specific individual.
Okay, I see. So it's not just a general duty out there in the world, it's a duty that someone has to you.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So, for example, if an employee has a claim against their employer for their wages,
Right.
that means the employer has a duty to that specific employee to pay those wages.
So the claim creates this very specific obligation between two parties.
Exactly. And these privileges and claims, the source notes, they primarily relate to what Hurt called primary rules.
Primary rules.
Yeah, these are rules that directly govern conduct.
Okay, so rules about what you can and can't do.
Exactly. But then Hofeld also identified these things called secondary rules.
Secondary rules are those like meta rules, rules about rules.
Exactly. And that's where power and immunity come into play.
Okay, so power and immunity are about how we change the primary rules.
You got it. So a Hofeldian power is the ability to alter your own or someone else's Hofeldian incidents.
So to change the existing privileges, claims, and so on.
Exactly. Think about signing a contract.
Okay.
By entering into that agreement, you and the other party are exercising a power.
The power to create new obligations.
Precisely. You're creating new claim rights and duties between you. Or think about the power of a testator to create a will.
Okay, so they have the power to determine what happens to their property after they die.
Exactly. They're altering property rights, which are made up of these various Hofeldian incidents.
So power is about changing the legal landscape, so to speak.
Exactly. And immunity is basically the flip side of power.
Okay, so if power is the ability to change things, immunity is the protection from being changed.
Precisely. If you have an immunity with respect to someone regarding some matter,
Right.
it means they lack the power to alter your Hofeldian incidents in that respect.
So they can't mess with your rights, basically.
Exactly. A classic example is the immunity of judges. They can't be sued for decisions they make in their official capacity.
Right, they have immunity from certain kinds of legal action.
Exactly. Private citizens lack the power to change the judge's legal obligations related to those decisions.
It's like a shield that protects them from undue influence or pressure.
Exactly. It's a crucial safeguard in a system of law.
Okay, so to recap,
Yeah.
privilege is the absence of a duty to not do something. Claim is a duty owed to you. Power is the ability to change things. and immunity is protection from change.
You got it.
Holfeld also presented these concepts in these tables of opposites and correlatives.
Ah, the tables. Those are fun.
They are. What's the
Yeah.
point of those tables?
They're really meant to show how these concepts are all logically interconnected.
Okay.
Like, claim is the correlative of duty.
Meaning?
If one exists, the other must also exist.
So if I have a claim against you, you automatically have a duty towards me.
Exactly. And privilege is the correlative of no right.
So if I have the privilege to do something, you have no right to stop me.
Precisely. The tables just lay out this whole logical system that Hofeld created.
It's a way of visualizing the relationships between these concepts.
Exactly. And it shows how they all fit together in this coherent framework.
So Hofeld gives us these basic building blocks of rights.
Right.
But then these elements can combine to form more complex rights.
Absolutely. The entry calls them molecular rights.
Molecular rights.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. Take property rights, for example.
Okay, property rights, those are always a fun topic.
They are, and they're a perfect example of molecular rights.
How so?
Well, your property right over, say, your computer.
Okay.
It's not just one single thing. It's a bundle of Hofeldian incidents.
So it's like a molecule made up of different atoms?
Exactly. You have the privilege to use your computer.
Right.
You have a claim against others not to damage it.
Right.
You have the power to sell it or give it away.
And presumably you have some immunity against others just taking it from you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All those incidents together make up your property, right?
Yeah.
It's like a legal recipe with all these different ingredients.
And the entry points out that these molecular rights can also have qualifications.
Qualifications, like what?
Well, your privilege to use your computer,
Right.
it doesn't extend to using it in a way that harms others.
So, like, I can't blast my music at full volume in a library.
Exactly. There are limits to your rights.
Right.
Even property rights, which are often seen as very strong.
So even within a single right, there can be all these different Hofeldian incidents at play.
Absolutely. And Wellman talks about this idea of a defining core of a right,
Okay.
which is like the fundamental aspect of that, right?
Right.
But then there are all these associated elements that can be present or absent.
So these associated elements, they kind of shape the contours of the right.
Exactly. They add nuance and complexity.
So Holmfeld gives us this really powerful tool for understanding the structure of rights.
He does.
But now we need to move from form to function.
Right, from the what to the why.
Exactly. What do rights actually do for the person who holds them? And here, the entry highlights this long-standing debate between the will theory and the interest theory.
Right, yes, the classic showdown.
Is the classic, isn't it? So let's start with the will theory. What's the basic idea behind that?
The will theory basically says that the main point of a right is to give the right holder a kind of control.
Control over what?
Control over the actions or duties of others.
Okay, so it's about having a say in how others treat you or what they owe you.
Exactly. The right holder, in this view, is like a mini-sovereign.
A mini-sovereign.
Yeah, they have this authority to waive, annul, or enforce the duties that others have towards them.
So like if someone promises you something, you have the right to release them from that promise.
Exactly. Or to demand that they fulfill it.
So the will theory really emphasizes this idea of choice, of agency.
It does. It sees rights as empowering individuals to make decisions about their own lives and how they interact with others.
That's a pretty powerful intuition about rights. But the source also mentions some serious weaknesses with the will theory.
Yeah, there are some tricky challenges.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one of the biggest problems is explaining unwaivable rights.
Unwaivable rights, right? Those are the ones you can't give up, even if you want to.
Exactly. Like the right not to be enslaved. If rights are all about this power to waive the corresponding duty,
Right.
then how can you have a right that you can't, by definition, give up?
Good point. So the will theory struggles to account for those kinds of fundamental, inalienable rights.
It does. And then there's the issue of rights held by people who lack the capacity for this kind of control.
Like infants or people with severe cognitive impairments.
Exactly. We generally believe that these individuals have rights.
Of course, the right to be cared for, the right not to be harmed.
Right. But they can't actively exercise the kind of control that the will theory emphasizes.
They can't exactly waive their rights or demand their enforcement.
Exactly. So that's another challenge for the will theory.
Okay, so the will theory has some holes. What about the interest theory? How does that approach the function of rights?
The interest theory basically says that the point of a right is to protect or advance the interests of the right holder.
Okay, so it's about benefiting the individual.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you have a right to property, not because you get to boss people around about your stuff,
Right.
but because owning things generally serves your interests.
It's good for you to have your own stuff.
Precisely. And a promisee has a right to the fulfillment of the promise because it's in their interest to receive what was promised.
So the focus shifts from control to benefit.
Exactly. And this helps explain things like unwaivable rights.
Right, because even if you can't waive the right, it's still serving your interests.
Precisely. And it also handles the rights of individuals who can't actively exercise their rights.
Like infants, again.
Right. Even though they can't demand their rights be respected, those rights still protect their interests.
Okay, so the interest theory seems to address some of the problems of the will theory.
It does. It's a more flexible approach in some ways.
But does it have its own weaknesses?
Yeah.
It seems like it could be too broad. Like, just because I have an interest in something doesn't mean I have a right to it.
That's a good point. And that's one of the main criticisms of the interest theory.
Like, I might have a huge interest in winning the lottery, but that doesn't mean I have a right to win the lottery.
Exactly. The entry uses the example of third-party beneficiaries.
Okay.
Like, if you and I make a contract that benefits a third person,
Right.
that third person might have a strong interest in us fulfilling the contract.
Sure, they're getting something out of it.
Right. But they don't necessarily have a legal right to enforce the contract.
So just having an interest isn't enough.
Exactly. And then there are cases where someone has a right, but the connection to their interests is kind of weak.
Give me an example.
Well, think about someone holding a public office.
Okay, like a judge or a senator.
Right. They have certain rights and responsibilities attached to that office,
Right.
but those rights might not directly serve their own interests.
Like, a judge has to make impartial rulings, even if those rulings go against their personal preferences.
Exactly. So the link between the right and the interest isn't always clear-cut.
It's more about the function of the role than the individual's own benefit.
Precisely. Now, the entry spends some time on Raz's formulation of the interest theory.
Raz, another big name in rights theory.
He is. And his theory is very influential. He basically says that you have a right if your well-being is a sufficient reason for holding someone else under a duty.
Okay, so my right to free speech is justified because my well-being is served by being able to express myself freely, and that's a good enough reason to hold others to the duty of not silencing me.
Exactly. But there are objections to Raz's view, too.
Like what?
Well, some argue that there are cases where the right holder's interest isn't the primary justification for the right.
Okay, so it's not always about the individual's own benefit.
Right. The entry uses the example of a journalist's right to protect their sources.
Okay, interesting example.
The journalist certainly has an interest in keeping their sources confidential.
Right, it's essential for their work.
But the main justification for that right is often seen as the public interest in a free press.
So it's about the broader social good, not just the journalist's individual interest.
Exactly. And Kahn raises a similar objection with the example of a promise to keep a secret.
Okay, so if I promise you I won't tell anyone your secret, that creates a duty on me.
Right.
But it's not necessarily because keeping the secret is in my best interest.
Exactly. It's more about the nature of the promise itself, the commitment I've made.
It seems like both the will theory and the interest theory have their strengths and weaknesses.
They do. They each capture something important about rights, but they both face challenges.
And the entry even suggests that maybe this whole idea of a single underlying function of rights is misguided.
Yeah, some philosophers are starting to question that.
Like maybe, right, isn't this unified concept with one essential purpose?
Right. Maybe it's more of a cluster concept, with different kinds of rights serving different functions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by looking for one single explanation.
Exactly. And that's led to the development of some alternative theories.
Like what?
Well, there are the demand theories, for example.
Demand theories. What are those about?
They focus on the right holder's ability to make demands or insist upon something as their due.
So it's not about control, like in the will theory, but about this standing to make a claim.
Exactly. You have a right because you have the standing to demand that others treat you in a certain way.
Okay, so it emphasizes agency, but not necessarily in the sense of waiving or enforcing duties.
Right. And this helps explain unwaivable rights.
Right, because even if you can't waive the right, you can still demand that it be respected.
Exactly. But demand theories also face challenges.
Like what?
While they have trouble explaining power rights, for example.
Right, because power rights aren't really about making demands. They're about having the ability to change things.
Exactly. And they also struggle to account for the rights of individuals who lack agency.
Like infants, yet again.
Right. If rights are all about making demands, then how can infants have rights?
Good point. So demand theories offer an interesting alternative, but they're not a perfect solution either.
No theory is perfect,
Oh,
unfortunately.
true enough. And then the entry mentions some other approaches as well.
Yeah, there's Scanlon's view of rights as constraints on action.
Okay, so rights set limits on what others can do to you.
Exactly. And Srinivasan proposes this kind of hybrid theory.
A hybrid theory,
No.
like a mix of will and interest.
Yeah, he tries to combine elements of both.
Interesting. And Wienar has a couple of theories as well.
He does. He's got the several functions theory.
Several functions, so different rights serve different purposes.
Exactly. And then he also has this kind desire theory.
Kind desire, what's that about?
It's a bit complicated, but it's basically grounded in these fundamental desires that he sees as inherent to certain roles and to being human.
Okay, I'd have to read more about that one to fully wrap my head around it.
Me too, probably. But the point is, there are lots of different ways to think about what rights are and how they're justified.
It's a rich and complex area of philosophical inquiry.
It is. And the debate is far from settled.
Now, the entry then shifts gears a bit and delves into the history of the language of rights.
Ah, yes, the history of how we talk about rights.
Exactly. And this is fascinating because it's not just about when the idea of rights emerged, but when the words we use to talk about them took on their modern meaning.
That's a crucial distinction for a philosopher.
It is. It's like the idea of social norms, permissions, and obligations. That probably goes back to the dawn of human societies.
Right, like, don't steal my mammoth.
Exactly. But when did we start using the term right in the way we understand it today?
That's the big question.
And the entry points out that the older objective sense of right was quite different from our modern subjective understanding.
Yeah, there was a real semantic shift.
Okay, so explain this objective versus subjective distinction.
So the older objective sense of right, it referred to what was just or lawful in a more general sense.
Oh, okay.
Like, think about the Latin term ius.
Ius, right? Like jurisprudence?
Exactly. It often referred to a whole body of law or to what was legally correct or proper.
So it wasn't about individual entitlements. It was about the law itself.
Right. And even when it was applied to individuals, it often meant what was due to them based on their role or status.
So it was about their place in the social order, not about their inherent rights.
Exactly. The entry uses this great example from Ulpian.
Yeah.
He talks about the edius of a parasite.
Parasite.
Yeah, someone who kills their father.
Oh, well.
And he says their edius is to be sewn into a sack with vipers and thrown into the river.
Wow, that's harsh.
It is. But the point is, it's not about a right in our modern sense.
It's about the punishment they deserve according to the law.
Exactly. It's a very different conception of right.
Okay, so when did this shift to the subjective sense of right, the one we're familiar with, start to happen?
That's a tricky question. There's a lot of debate among historians about the timeline.
Right, because language changes gradually. It's not like there's one specific moment.
Exactly. But the entry identifies two main trends in the scholarship.
Okay, what are they?
One is this tendency to push the origins of the modern concept further and further back in time.
So instead of saying it emerged in the Enlightenment,
Right.
we're now saying it might have roots in medieval thought or even earlier.
Exactly. And then the other trend is the observation that terms for what we'd now call active rights.
Active
Yeah.
rights, those are privilege and power, right?
Exactly. Those terms seem to have appeared earlier than terms for passive rights, like claim and immunity.
Interesting. So the idea of having the freedom to do something or the authority to do something,
Right.
that seems to have developed before the idea of having a claim against others or an immunity from their actions.
Exactly. It's like the concept of right evolved from a focus on action to a focus on protection.
That's a fascinating insight. Now, speaking of action and protection, rights are obviously deeply connected to the idea of freedom.
Absolutely. Rights are often seen as essential for protecting individual freedom.
And the Hofeldian framework we talked about earlier, it actually provides a really helpful way to see these connections.
It does. The active incidents, privilege and power, they're basically about freedom to...
Freedom to do what you want, freedom to exercise your agency.
Exactly. Privilege gives you the freedom to act without being restricted.
Like you have the freedom to speak your mind, the freedom to travel.
Right. And power gives you the freedom to change your normative situation or someone else's.
Like the freedom to enter into a contract or the freedom to make a will.
Exactly. And the entry points out that even if you're physically prevented from exercising a privilege,
Right, like the spy in prison who can't actually access classified information.
exactly, they still have that privilege in a normative sense.
The permission still exists, even if the ability to act on it doesn't.
Exactly. And then having multiple privileges gives you even more freedom.
Like the freedom to do something or not to do it.
Right, like the freedom to join a protest or not.
So it's not just about the freedom to act, it's also about the freedom to choose.
Precisely. And then passive rights claim and immunity, they're more about freedom from.
Freedom from interference, freedom from harm.
Exactly. Claim rights protect you from certain kinds of actions by others.
Like the right to be free from assault, or the right to not have your property stolen.
Right. And immunity rights protect you from the arbitrary exercise of power.
So like the freedom from being arbitrarily detained by the government.
Exactly. Immunity protects you from having your normative situation changed against your will.
It's like a safeguard against tyranny.
It is. And the source points out that you can view the whole legal system as a way of distributing these different forms of freedom.
It's like a giant web of rights and duties, all designed to specify who can do what and who's protected from what.
Exactly. And a political constitution is like a blueprint for this distribution of freedom.
It lays out the fundamental rights and freedoms that citizens have and how power is distributed within the government.
Right. So you've got the separation of powers, for example.
Right, the idea that power should be divided between different branches of government.
Exactly. And that's all based on this idea of rights. Who has the power to do what and who's immune from whose power.
It's like a delicate balancing act.
It is. And it's all designed to safeguard individual freedom and prevent the abuse of power.
So we've explored the nature of rights, their history, their connection to freedom. But now we come to a crucial question. Rights and reasons.
Ah, yes. This is the heart of the matter.
It is. Why do rights have this special normative force? Why do they seem to carry more weight than other moral considerations?
It's a question that's puzzled philosophers for centuries.
And the entry points out that there's this broad agreement that rights do have a special force.
They do. They're often seen as trumps against other considerations.
Trumps, that's Dworkin's term, right?
It is. And it's a very evocative metaphor.
It is. Like, rights are the ace card that wins the hand? No.